Buildings remember things people forget. Observatories remember at the one moment nobody else is watching. The instant the dome closes for night. Osgood Prentice has spent 26 years learning to notice that moment inside the Calder Hill Public Observatory, a dome structure built in 1933 on a modest municipal hilltop, home to a working refractor telescope, still used for public viewing nights and school programs decades after the surrounding city had grown up around it in electric light. He was 60 now, observatory keeper, responsible for the dome's rotation gears, its shutter mechanism, and the slow, deliberate machinery that let a building open its single eye to the sky and close it again every night without fail. He had learned to trust that closing moment from a man named Winslow Aldercott, who had kept the dome for 24 years before him and who believed, quietly and completely, that a dome which couldn't close square was telling you, in the only language it had, that its own shape had changed. Osgood started at Calder Hill at 34, hired as Aldercott's assistant during a period when the observatory's small board was debating whether public astronomy was worth the maintenance budget at all. Aldercott was 61 then, spare and unhurried, a man who climbed the narrow catwalk to the dome's rail every clear night the way other men checked a lock on their way to bed. The sky doesn't care if we're ready, Aldercott told him during Osgood's first week, the two of them standing at the shutter controls as the great curved panel eased shut above them with a low mechanical sigh. But the dome cares whether it's square. If the shutter won't seat flush, something under this building has stopped agreeing with the shape it was built to hold. You just have to be paying attention at the one moment of night when it's honest with you. Aldercott kept alignment logs, nightly notes recording exactly how many degrees off true the shutter sat when fully closed, checked by eye against a set of fixed marks he'd scribed into the rail himself decades earlier. The observatory never asked this of him. He did it the way some men check a pulse, because the habit itself felt like care. Osgood remembered his first winter climbing the catwalk behind Aldercott, watching the older man scribe a new mark into the rail with a cold chisel one November evening, adjusting an existing line by what looked like nothing at all. He'd asked why bother, if the difference was too small to see without already knowing where to look. Aldercott had set the chisel down carefully before answering, the way he did everything. Because someday the difference won't be small, he'd said, and whoever's standing here then is going to need to know exactly where it started. When Aldercott retired, he left Osgood the logs, along with a piece of advice Osgood had carried for 26 years since. Watch where it binds. A dome doesn't bind randomly. It binds exactly where the ground beneath it has changed its mind. Calder Hill's dome was a simple, elegant structure by the standards of its era, a hemispherical shell of riveted steel plate, rotating on a ring of wheels atop a circular masonry curb wall, with a two-piece shutter that slid open along curved rails to expose the sky. The telescope itself, an 8-inch refractor mounted on a pier sunk deep into the hilltop's bedrock, had guided 3 generations of amateur astronomers in grade school field trips toward the same patient stars. Osgood knew the dome the way he knew his own house. He knew which rotation gear needed grease before the autumn dew set in, and which section the catwalk decking flexed slightly underfoot near the north stair. He knew the particular echo of the shutter mechanism on cold nights, and the smell of gear oil and old canvas that lived permanently in the small workshop beneath the dome floor. And he knew, better than anyone alive, that the shutter had never once closed perfectly flush on the northeast quadrant. IT wasn't dramatic. Visitors on public nights never noticed it. Even most of the volunteer docents who ran school programs had no idea the gap existed, since it appeared only in the last few inches of the shutter's travel, at the very end of closing, in a spot 15 degrees off the north mark on Aldercott's scribe rail. School children filing out after a viewing session heard only the low mechanical groan of the shutter easing shut behind them, the same sound every single time, never suspecting that sound carried a small, private argument between the shutter and the wall that only 2 men in the building's 90-year history had ever bothered to notice. Aldercott's earliest surviving entry about it, dated 1987, read, "Asterisk shutter still binding at the northeast quadrant on close. Rail cleaned, cogs greased, drive chain tensioned twice. Gap persists at the same 15-degree mark every single night. The rail isn't warped. Something under it has shifted. Watching it, asterisk." Osgood had read that entry during his first winter with the logs, sitting in the small workshop beneath the dome floor with a space heater ticking beside him, and felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Aldercott had noticed something real. Aldercott had never solved it, and Aldercott had kept climbing the catwalk anyway, night after clear night, patient enough to record a pattern he never got to finish explaining. Osgood continued the closing checks without ever being asked to. Each clear night, at the end of his shift, he watched the shutter ease toward its seat and checked the northeast quadrant against Aldercott's scribe marks. The bind was always there, always the same general location, always small enough to close the shutter anyway, with a slightly firmer push on a hand crank than any other quadrant required. In his 11th year with the logs, Osgood began measuring the bind point precisely rather than simply confirming it existed. A small protractor fixed to the rail, a habit that took him a few extra minutes each closing, and seemed, for a long while, to add nothing Aldercott's simpler notes hadn't already said. It took nearly a decade of those precise readings to show him what Aldercott's descriptions never could. The bind point wasn't staying at 15 degrees. It was migrating, a fraction of a degree further along the rail each year, so slowly that any two consecutive seasons looked identical, but unmistakably different across 10 years of careful numbers laid end to end. He sat with that realization one clear winter night in the workshop, the dome silent above him between viewing sessions. Aldercott's oldest log open beside his own decade of readings, the two records laid side by side under the workbench lamp like two witnesses finally being asked to compare their stories. Two men, one shutter. 35 years of the same quiet question, asked over and over without either of them ever demanding an answer before they were ready to trust it. If the migration had been happening since Aldercott's first 1987 entry, the entire curb wall beneath the dome ring wasn't simply out of true in one fixed spot. It was slowly rotating, the whole circle beneath the dome, very gradually turning around some point Osgood couldn't see, carrying the bind mark with it degree by degree, year by year. He thought about every school group that had filed to the dome across 3 decades, every retiree squinting through the eyepiece at Saturn's rings, every one of them standing on a ring of stone that had been quietly twisting beneath their feet the entire time, patient and undetectable, while the only two people paying attention to it kept climbing a catwalk at the end of the night to check. He wrote a new entry beneath Aldercott's oldest one, in the same plain hand, asterisk 10 years of precise bearings confirm the bind point is not fixed. It is migrating along the rail, slowly, consistently, 'cause still unknown, continuing to measure, asterisk. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest word available to him. Osgood had a theory, in his 15th year, that the cause might simply be uneven where in the dome's original 1933 wheel bearings, the steel rollers that carried the dome rings weight around the curb wall, worn unevenly enough after 90 years to introduce a slow wobble into the rotation that would explain a drifting bind. He spent the better part of summer inspecting every wheel bearing on the ring, measuring where patterns, replacing the two most worn assemblies, convinced he had finally found something a mechanic could simply swap out. The bind resisted afterward, unchanged, in exactly the same migrating pattern it had followed for years. The bearings, even the two he'd replaced, had nothing to do with it. The dome ring rotated true on its wheels. Whatever was moving wasn't the ring. It was the wall the ring sat on. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the log, in the same unembellished style Aldercott had taught it without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Asterisk wheel bearing theory. Ruled out. New bearings installed. Bind pattern unchanged. The ring rotates true. The curb wall beneath it does not. Back to unexplained. Asterisk. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the bearings to be the answer, replaceable, mechanical, a work order, and a closed question. Being wrong meant the cause lived somewhere inside a 90-year-old masonry curb wall, beneath a dome that thousands of visitors had stood under without ever suspecting the ground beneath their feet had an opinion of its own. The preservation grant arrived in his 22nd year. Calder Hill secured funding to fully restore the dome's aging drive mechanism, new motorized rail supports, replacing the original hand crank system that had served since 1933, installed at evenly spaced points around the curb wall, according to the observatory's as-built drawings. The grant celebrated the dome's mechanical history, even as it modernized its muscles. Osgood read the engineering brief and felt an old unease sharpen. The new supports would be bolted directly into the curb wall at fixed intervals, treating every section of that 90-year-old ring as structurally identical. If his theory was right, if the northeast quadrant's foundation had been quietly rotating for decades, the new rigid supports would be anchored into the one section of wall that had never actually stopped moving. He brought Aldercott's logs, along with his own 11 years of precise bearings, to the restoration project's structural engineer. The engineer, a capable and fair-minded man named Thaddeus Krell, surveyed the curb wall with level across its full circumference and found it sound and within tolerance at every point he measured. Every section reads level within a hair, Krell said, reviewing his own survey data at the workshop table. If there were an active structural movement of the kind you're describing, I'd expect to see it in a level survey, and I don't. My honest read is cumulative slack in the original 1933 drive chain, 90 years of wear, easy enough to explain a small persistent bind. The new motorized supports eliminate that slack by design. I think this resolves itself the day we install them. The bind point has moved for as long as I've been measuring it, Osgood said. A drive chain doesn't migrate 15 degrees along a rail over a decade. It just gets loose. This isn't looseness. Something under that section of curb wall is turning, slowly, and it's been turning since before I started. Krell considered that, and to his credit, didn't dismiss it. I don't have another explanation for the migration you're describing, but a level survey that reads sound at every point doesn't give me grounds to treat one section of curb differently in the installation plan. The grant timeline doesn't include exploratory foundation work without a documented structural concern. It was a reasonable position, and Osgood didn't have an engineering credential to argue against it. What there was 35 years of a bind point that had moved in one direction only, a ruled-out theory, and a growing conviction that a level survey measured the top of the wall, not whatever was happening underneath it. Osgood didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to a question he couldn't put down. What if Krell was right, and 35 years of careful measuring amounted to nothing more than an old drive chain's ordinary where a pattern he and Aldercott, between them, had slowly polished into a mystery through nothing but accumulated devotion to a habit neither of them had ever needed to justify? He had wanted, for years, for the migrating bind to mean something. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually mattering. He climbed the catwalk one clear night after the last viewing session, alone, and stood at the northeast quadrant with Aldercott's oldest log in hand, rereading the 1987 entry under a small work light. Asterisk the rail isn't warped. Something under it has shifted. Watching it, asterisk. Aldercott had never known the cause either. He had simply kept climbing night after clear night, trusting that the pattern was worth preserving even without an explanation attached. Osgood had inherited that trust without ever fully testing whether it could stand against a clean level survey and a reasonable engineer's timeline. He didn't have the cause confirmed. But not having it hadn't stopped Aldercott from writing the first entry in 1987, and it wasn't a reason for Osgood to stop now. Not with rigid new supports about to be bolted into a section of wall his own numbers said was still quietly turning. He requested, at his own initiative, a single day with foundation specialists before the new supports were installed. Not to delay the restoration. He made clear only to look beneath the curb wall at the northeast quadrant while the grant's own scaffolding was already in place. The specialist was a woman named Priya Anand, who assessed older masonry foundations for settlement in hidden voids. She reviewed the observatory's 1933 construction drawings and its 1958 telescope upgrade records alongside Osgood's decade of bearings, and she brought ground-penetrating radar, the scan beneath the curb wall, at the exact quadrant where the bind persisted. What the scan revealed, confirmed by a small exploratory core taken the following morning, explained 35 years of a bind point that nobody had ever been able to name. Directly beneath the northeast curb wall sat a shallow brick-lined chamber, a decommissioned utility vault. Built in 1933 to house the original telescope's counterweight mechanism, abandoned and backfilled during the 1958 upgrade when the counterweight system was redesigned. The 1958 crew had filled the vault and moved on. Nobody had recorded it on any surviving drawing, because by 1958 the vault had already stopped mattering to anyone but the ground around it. That backfill was never properly compacted. Priya explained, showing Osgood the radar plot at the workshop table. For 60-some years, the soil inside that old vault has been settling under its own weight, slowly, unevenly. The curb wall sitting on top of it has been very gradually rotating around that soft spot, not sinking straight down. Rotating, the way a table leg twists, slightly if one corner of the floor beneath it gives a little at a time. That's your migrating bind. The dome ring is rotating true. The wall it sits on has been quietly turning beneath it for decades. A level survey wouldn't catch that, Osgood said. A level survey measures whether the top of the wall is flat, Priya said. It doesn't measure whether the whole ring is slowly twisting around a hidden point. Your protractor did. You were measuring the one thing in this building actually built to notice. Osgood looked up at the dome's curve above them, closed for the day, ordinary and silent. 90 years of astronomers had trusted that shell to be a perfect, unchanging circle, precisely because circles were what domes were supposed to be. Nobody had ever thought to ask whether the ground holding that circle up had an opinion of its own. Nobody except a man with a scribe and a cold chisel, 40 years before radar existed to prove him right. Aldecott never had a name for it, he said. He just knew the shutter was telling the truth. It was, Priya said, it's been telling the truth every single night since 1987. It just took someone willing to keep listening. Priya's findings went to the Restoration Committee within the week. Thaddeus Krell reviewed the radar plot and the core sample personally and called Osgood afterward. You were right to push for this, Krell said. My survey told me the truth about every point I measured. It just never occurred to me to ask whether the whole ring was twisting around something nobody had drawn. If we bolted rigid motorized supports into that quadrant as planned, we'd have been fighting an active rotation with fixed hardware, repeated support failure at best, a shutter that could bind mid-motion above a full dome at worst. The installation plan was revised. The old vault's backfill was properly stabilized before any new supports went in, and the northeast quadrant's mounting points were engineered with adjustable hardware specifically accounting for the wall's slow, ongoing settlement rather than assuming a fixed circle. The rest of the drive mechanism was restored on schedule, motorized and modern, resting finally on a curb wall whose real behavior had been measured rather than assumed. Calder Hill filed a formal note in its facilities archive, crediting both Winslow Aldecott's original 1987 observation and Osgood's 26 years of continued measurement as the reason a hidden foundation condition had been found and properly addressed before rigid modern hardware locked the assumption of a perfect circle into place for another 90 years. Osgood kept Aldecott's logs. He added a final entry beneath the oldest one before moving the whole collection into the observatory's permanent archive. Asterisk northeast quadrant stabilized and refitted with adjustable mounts this year. Migration traced to an improperly backfilled 1933 utility vault, documented through the shutter's bind since 1987. First season on record with no drift in the bearing. Winslow, you were right. The dome was never confused about its own shape. The ground beneath it was the one still making up its mind. Neither of us knew why for a very long time. Asterisk. He climbed the catwalk on a clear night not long after and watched the shutter ease close at the end of the last viewing session, the northeast quadrant seating flush against a rail, while the familiar firm push he'd given it out of habit for 26 years. He checked it against Aldecott's scribe marks anyway, the way he always had. Square, fully square, for the first time in the dome's recorded history. He thought about Aldecott, standing at the same rail decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire that the dome cares whether it's square, and that you only have to be paying attention at the one moment of night when it's honest with you. Osgood had carried that sentence through 26 years, through a ruled-out bearing theory, through a season of real doubt about whether 2 careers of nightly checks had amounted to anything more than a shared habit neither man had ever needed to explain. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep watching, the way Aldecott had taught him, until the dome finally told him, at the one honest moment every clear night offered, exactly what the ground beneath it had been quietly deciding for 90 years.